You ready to tackle a real head scratcher? We're talking about Iran today.
Always up for a challenge.
So, Iran, amazing resources, young population, strategically located, but their economy, not exactly thriving. It's kind of baffling, right?
Yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle. A country with so much potential yet.
We're diving into a podcast episode called Why No One Can Defeat Iran, The Untold Truth from N12 Degrees.
Okay, I'm familiar with that one.
And get this, they say Iran's sitting on 5% of the world's extractable metals, more oil than the UAE and Qatar combined.
Wow, that's a serious amount of wealth just waiting to be tapped.
So what's the deal? What's holding them back?
Well, that's what this deep dive is all about, right? Unraveling this paradox.
Right. So let's start with what's going on inside Iran. This podcast mentions these things called Boneyards.
Ah, yes, the Boneyards.
What are they exactly? Some kind of secret society.
Huh? Not quite. They're powerful institutions, originally set up for good causes, managing charities, helping the poor.
Okay, noble goals.
But over time, they gained a ton of economic and political power. We're talking about controlling 20% of the Iranian economy.
20%, that's massive. No wonder the private sector struggles to compete.
Yeah, it creates this uneven playing field, stifles competition. And get this, these boneyards operate with very little transparency.
Oh, so it's like this shadowy system where a select few benefit, kind of holding the country back from its potential?
Precisely. It hinders growth, prevents diversifying the economy.
Which makes their reliance on oil even more problematic, I'd imagine.
Absolutely. The podcast points out that almost 70% of Iran's exports are oil.
Wow, that's putting a lot of eggs in one basket, especially with the world shifting away from fossil fuels.
It's a risky strategy for sure.
So we've got these internal factors, but then there's the pressure from the outside world. All those sanctions.
Oh yeah, the sanctions have been a major hurdle for Iran, especially those imposed by the U.S.
Really limiting their access to global markets, right?
It's tough. They're essentially cut off from trading freely, participating in the global economy. Makes development incredibly difficult.
It's wild. The podcast actually says Iran's faced more sanctions than North Korea.
It's true. And that kind of isolation definitely hinders economic progress. But here's the thing. Iran's known for its resilience. They've faced empires, revolutions, wars.
Yeah. How do they keep bouncing back?
Well, geography plays a big role. Iran's mountainous terrain acts like a natural fortress.
Ah, makes sense. A real-life shield against invasions.
Exactly. But this same geography also limits their access to the sea, funneling everything through the Strait of Hormuz.
So it's both a blessing and a curse. This choke point becomes super important for them.
Absolutely. And then there's Iran's internal makeup, a real mix of different ethnic groups.
Persians, Azeris.
Baluchis, Kurds, Arabs, you name it, Iran's got it.
So a melting pot of cultures. But could that also create tension?
It's both a source of strength and a potential vulnerability. While diversity can be a unifying force, it also creates fault lines that external players think Israel, Saudi Arabia might try to exploit. Some of these groups have connections to neighboring populations, adding another layer of complexity.
Wow, that's a lot to juggle. How do they manage it?
Well, historically, Iran has used the Shiite-Sunni divide within Islam to rally the nation, creating a sort of us versus them mentality when facing outside threats.
Right, a way to unify when under pressure.
Yeah.
But does that still work today?
It's starting to show cracks. Sunni minorities, like the Baluchis, are demanding more autonomy, and the government's response has been to label dissent as terrorism, especially after those 2022 protests.
So the old playbook isn't working as well as it used to.
Exactly. And all of this brings up a big question. Can Iran be defeated?
Yeah, some countries seem to think so, betting on those ethnic tensions to weaken them.
Right. But Iran has a long history of resisting both invasion and internal fragmentation. They seem to know how to turn their weaknesses into advantages.
They've developed a kind of resilience that's hard to crack.
Precisely. But there's another piece to this puzzle, a human element that we need to consider.
What's that?
The underrepresentation of women in the Iranian workforce. Imagine, they have a highly educated female population, yet they face so many barriers to entering the workforce.
Wow, sidelining half your potential talent. That's crazy.
It is. It goes back to what we discussed earlier about the system being rigged against growth. It's not just the boneyards, but deeper societal structures holding the country back.
Makes you wonder what it would take for real change to happen. Could Iran actually unlock its full potential, both economically and socially?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
But we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Right. Let's take a break and come back to unpack this fascinating puzzle a little further. There's much more to explore. We were just talking about women in Iran and how they face barriers to joining the workforce.
Yeah, it's a real shame. The podcast makes this point that despite Iranian women being highly educated, they struggle to enter the workforce. Imagine sidelining half your population, all that talent going untapped.
It's mind-blowing. Think of the innovation and progress they're missing out on. It really underscores those systemic issues within Iran. It's not just about the economy, it's about deeply ingrained social structures. They're limiting opportunities for so many people.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Iran's resilience. They've weathered centuries of internal and external pressures, suggesting a real capacity for adaptation, don't you think?
That's a good point. They've been through the fire and come out stronger, but maybe a bit less flexible, less open to change.
That's a great way to put it. So the question becomes, can those forces that have made Iran so resilient also be the catalyst for positive change? Could they use that strength to break free from limitations and reach their full potential?
Now, that's a thought-provoking question. Does the podcast offer any insights into whether they're capable of such a transformation?
Well, it doesn't have any concrete predictions, but it does mention that Iran's younger generation, especially those who grew up under sanctions, crave a more open and connected society,
So there's this internal push for change simmering below the surface.
potentially. And that desire for change could be amplified by the economic realities. Decades of sanctions have taken their toll. Ordinary Iranians are feeling the squeeze.
Rising costs, limited opportunities, isolation from the global community. It sounds like a recipe for unrest.
In a way, yes. That pressure could push the government toward a different path. To improve lives and secure Iran's place in the global economy, they might have to change course. And that includes tackling those deeply rooted social issues we discussed.
So there's a glimmer of hope for a more open and prosperous Iran. But it all hinges on their willingness to adapt and evolve.
Exactly. And it's not just about Iran. The podcast reminds us that their future is intertwined with the rest of the world. A stable and prosperous Iran would benefit everyone, from their neighbors in the Middle East to the global community at large.
It's a reminder that we're all connected. Seemingly far-off events can have ripple effects across the globe.
Precisely. So understanding these complexities and recognizing the human element behind the headlines is key. It's crucial for navigating the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead.
Absolutely. And speaking of challenges and opportunities, the podcast mentioned those recent Israeli attacks on Iran. Could this be a turning point? Could it push Iran further into isolation or open the door to dialogue and change?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Impossible to predict for sure. What we do know is that these attacks are a significant escalation. Iran's response will be critical in shaping what comes next.
Sounds like we're at a crossroads with many potential paths ahead. A bit unsettling, to be honest.
I understand that feeling. But it's also important to remember that the future isn't set in stone. There's still room for choices, for actions that can lead to better outcomes.
So even amidst all the complexity and uncertainty, there's still hope for a brighter future.
Absolutely. But it will require a shift in mindset, a willingness to move beyond us versus them and embrace a more nuanced and empathetic understanding of Iran's realities.
A tall order, but one worth striving for. The stakes are incredibly high, not just for Iran, but for the entire region and maybe even the world.
Exactly. And with that in mind, let's explore some potential scenarios for Iran's future. Let's consider the factors we've discussed and see what might be possible.
Sounds like we're heading into the final act of this deep dive. I'm eager to see where it takes us. All right, so we've talked about Iran's potential, the pressures they face, those recent attacks. Where do we go from here? What does the future hold?
That's the million-dollar question. As we've discussed, there are many paths forward, each with its own hurdles and opportunities. One path, and some countries favor this, is exploiting those ethnic tensions within Iran.
The divide and conquer strategy. But we also talked about how Iran has historically resisted that kind of approach.
Right? They've weathered external pressures and internal divisions for centuries. Their mountainous terrain, their strategic use of Shiite identity, their adaptability. These have all contributed to their resilience.
So destabilizing Iran wouldn't be easy, even with those internal fault lines.
It's definitely not a guaranteed outcome.
Yeah.
And we need to think about the potential fallout. Fueling instability in a region as volatile as the Middle East is incredibly risky.
It could easily backfire, create even more chaos and violence, not to mention the human cost.
Exactly. That's why it's important to consider other paths forward, ones that focus on diplomacy, dialogue, and understanding.
Okay, so let's talk about those alternatives. Is there any sign that the powers that be, both within Iran and internationally, are open to that kind of approach?
Well, it's a mixed bag. The podcast highlights this tension between hardliners within the Iranian government and a younger generation that wants more engagement with the world.
So a potential internal push for change, but it's facing resistance from those in power.
That's one way to see it. And this is where the economic situation becomes really important. The Iranian people have been living under sanctions for decades. It's hurting their economy and they're feeling the pressure.
Makes sense. If people are struggling to get by, they're going to want solutions. They're going to want change.
Exactly. And that could force the government's hand. If they want to improve people's lives and secure Iran's place in the global economy, they might have to reconsider their current path.
So the economic pressure could actually create an opportunity for a better relationship with the West.
It's possible, but it would require a change in thinking on both sides, a willingness to let go of past grievances and come to the table in good faith.
That sounds like a big ask. But what if it did happen? What would a more prosperous and internationally connected Iran look like?
It's a really interesting thought. Imagine Iran seen not as a threat, but as a partner in tackling global problems. They have so much to offer: a young population, a rich culture, and a strategic location connecting Asia, Europe, and the Middle East.
They could be a real force for stability in a region that desperately needs it.
Exactly. And everyone would benefit. The Iranian people would have more economic opportunities in a more open society. The region would see less tension and more cooperation. And the world would benefit from Iran's contributions on issues like climate change and energy.
It's a hopeful vision, but it comes back to that question: are those in power in Iran and around the world willing to take that leap of faith?
That's the big unknown. But this podcast reminds us that we shouldn't underestimate the power of humans to make choices. We can shape our future, make decisions that lead to something better.
So what can we do? How can we as individuals help create a more hopeful future for Iran and the world?
First, educate ourselves. Move beyond the simple stories and truly understand the complexities.
See the human faces behind the headlines.
Right. And then engage in constructive dialogue. Challenge those who promote fear and division. Support policies that encourage peace and cooperation.
It sounds like a long and difficult road, but a road worth traveling.
I agree. The stakes are too high to give up hope. Iran's future is still being written, and we can play a part in shaping it.
Well said. That's a powerful thought to leave our listeners with. This deep dive has really opened my eyes. Iran is so much more than the headlines, and the road ahead has both obstacles and opportunities.
It's a story that's still unfolding. I encourage everyone to stay informed, stay curious, and don't lose sight of hope for a better future.
And on that note, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Iran. We've covered a lot, but this is just the beginning. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep looking for those glimmers of hope. Until next time, deep divers.